Okay.
Hello, this is the Duty to Warn vidcast. I'm your host, John Gartner, and today we have with us Betty Teng. She has a very interesting background. She graduated from Yale University and got an MFA from the UCLA Film School and started a career in film, working with some of the greats, Ang Lee, Robert Altman, Mike Nichols. These are certainly big names. And then for some reason decided to go into the mental health field and got a social work degree at NYU and is now in psychoanalytic training at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy. So, Ms. Teng, I wanted to actually, we've talked to a lot of people about what's wrong with Donald Trump, what's wrong with him psychologically, but what I was really interested to talk to you about, because of your work in trauma, is what effect you think Donald Trump's election has had psychologically on the people that you work with and the populations that you see, and the population in general.
Um, uh, yeah, I treat at a major hospital in Manhattan survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And right after the election, folks were really hit hard, particularly my sexual assault survivors, because he had been accused of assault, he had been accused of
That's right.
harassment, and none of it came to any consequence. Didn't even seem to harm his election possibilities. And I had patients literally say, "Well, I've been mulling over reporting my crime, and now I'm not going to anymore." They had a loss of hope. Um, One of them said, "We elected a rapist to the presidency." So it was a real invalidating experience for them.
Yeah, I could only imagine. And the sense that this guy is going to get away with it, that it doesn't matter. The people didn't believe the victims. I mean, all of this must have had a great deal of resonance for them.
Absolutely. I think that when you look at somebody who some people see as a perpetrator elected to the highest office in the country, who seems unrepentant and, in fact, quite proud of what he's done in terms of getting away with all sorts of violent um, assertions and acts, if you want to call, quote, pussy grabbing a violent act, which I would, then he really has a great impact on people who have been previously traumatized, who feel like they struggle to have their voices heard, and they struggle against folks like Trump, who have a lot of power, and they feel like their voices are falling on deaf ears.
You know, as therapists, we've all had patients who were abused, who weren't believed, who saw their perpetrators who were in positions of power continue in those positions of power and make them feel as if what happened to them didn't matter or no one believed them or acted as if it didn't happen. What were some of the internal then processes that some of these people were going through? I imagine for them it must have been a kind of re-traumatization.
Absolutely. I mean, we had to do a lot of work around how people went on with their daily lives. And I had a patient who was an Arab student who saw swastikas uh, on the door of a Muslim Students Association that she had to walk past. So it was like a double assault on her, and other patients who had seen swastikas on their dorm room whiteboards, and this was a Jewish patient. And so, we're talking about sort of religious trauma, discrimination, and sexual assault trauma. So it's really these intersecting identities that really Trump has gone against. I mean, I think that he speaks to a certain normalized identity, which really cuts out a lot of people and makes them feel like they're not welcome here, their voices are not to be heard, their voices are not valid, and that's a real challenge for us as therapists to work against when we're trying to say, yes, your voices do matter, yes, your subjectivity is important, yes, your daily lives can be free again.
You know, and you mentioned other vulnerable populations. I don't know if you've seen this in your practice, but for example, I have a patient who fled a country in South America because he was tortured, and came here as a refugee many years ago. Has been very successful in his new life, but it's brought back all of these old feelings. He thought he escaped all this, and now it's feeling like it's happening again. Have you seen that?
I have seen that. I have seen folks who don't feel safe traveling, who don't feel safe this was right after the election. It's faded a little bit more. Don't feel safe walking down the street because of the identities they hold. He's really created an atmosphere of fear in those who feel that he does not, whom he does not represent, or who he's actively said that, such as the immigrant populations in New York, so many people hold that identity, that this is just not a place where, and even if you have a green card, many people who have them feel afraid to leave the country for fear they won't be able to come back, which is just a real shame. Personally, but professionally, it's a very hard thing to work against, as you probably know.
And it's hard to separate fact and fantasy, as we know as clinicians, but in fact, as you point out with the swastikas, there has been a dramatic increase in all kinds of hate crimes, many of which are, the vast majority of which obviously are not reported, but we all have anecdotes.
Yes, absolutely. We do. I personally have one. My son's playground was defaced with the swastika on a train jungle gym. And at the time he's 5, and so we had to face trying to explain to a 5-year-old what a swastika is. And that is just not something any parent really wants to have to do. And that particularly hit home for me, and you know, it was removed immediately, but it really made me feel vulnerable. I mean, I hold a lot of vulnerable identities just like my patients do, so it really is it's become a difficult space, and I'm sure you feel the same way as a clinician, how to treat patients when you're feeling the same way yourself. It's
if we're feeling frightened,
it's a real dance.
Right. If we're feeling frightened, what are we supposed to tell them?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. I had a patient say, you know, I just push through and I soldier on. I don't know if that's the right thing to do. And I was thinking, yeah, well,
join the club.
This is what I'm doing too. So it's hard. It's very hard. It's very hard, and it continues to be hard. So I think it's the truth aspect of our work in trauma treatment is a cornerstone of work to have our patients really understand that what they went through is what they went through, so that we can work together and I and others can bear witness to their traumas. And when we have somebody in office whose relationship with the truth is very slippery, who's advocating through spokespeople alternative facts, it's very hard to hold any kind of grounding for oneself and for one's patients, and I think it's become even more important to emphasize this aspect of what our patients experience here at the Office of Victim Services is their experience, and it's valid to them, and it's what we can work with.
That's an excellent point. So in addition to his racism and his inflammatory language, there's also his habitual lying. And I think that's very important, because I think what you're saying is in the treatment of trauma, first of all, when people experience trauma, as we know, if they're invalidated and people say it didn't happen, that compounds the damage, whereas the research shows, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the research shows that if people do acknowledge the trauma, it helps them to be much more resilient in coping with it. But also, as people who are remembering traumas, they need to basically affirm that they did go through what they went through, they didn't make it up, and that it really happened, and they have to, at some level, accept the reality that it did happen. When you have someone who is a leader who is chronically lying, that atmosphere of lies must also contribute to the feeling of unsafety and confusion and disorientation.
Yeah, I think it's extremely destabilizing, and this is where the line between traumatized and previously traumatized and, quote, untraumatized starts to break down, because I think his lying and his saying that he did fire Comey and he didn't fire Comey, he wanted to, he didn't want to, these kinds of things start to destabilize us all, and we start to wonder what exactly was said, when, and how. And I think it's unprecedented in a president to have this kind of an outrageous relationship with the truth, and his insistence on his own reality. But you know, looking at trauma treatment, this kind of difficulty in connecting with one's experience as a point of reality is extremely destabilizing. And where the trauma survivors, it's so horrific, a lot of times they disassociate and they don't want to remember. And yet they have these experiences, or they have these somatic symptoms, and they have bits and pieces of memories if they're childhood survivors of sexual abuse, and the work is about putting this truth together and creating a stable situation from which they can think and reflect on what happened. If that isn't there, then there's no ability to stop chaos from reigning internally in a microsystem. But in a macro system, I think it's the same thing. We are not given the ability to know what happened, when, and how, and that creates a destabilization, which removes our ability to think and really have some measured idea of what's going on.
Yeah, I have this image of thousands of people walking around Manhattan who have been traumatized in some way or another, who are all to one or more or less, greater or less degree in a dissociated state. The thousands of people who are in a state of dissociation wandering the streets of New York right now.
I mean, I had a patient, and this is a little bit slightly different. He's a domestic violence survivor, and the London Bridge terrorist attacks really affected him. And then he got a lot of news feeds, and I think that this is related because there's so many bits of news feeds that come with outrageous or scandalous pieces of information that Trump has tweeted, or that he's changed course on something. And what happened to my patient was, with all these news feeds, it kept kind of re-traumatizing him, because some of the aspects of the London Bridge attacks were similar to what he had gone through. And I just had to say to him, okay, turn off the news feed. I think this is going to help you stabilize. And, you know, I think Trump's sort of magic is in the sense that we can't look away. He is very, very skilled at calling us to his attention by his words, by his aggressive acts, by his shifts in mood, and we can't look away. But I think it's very important that we try to, because he shuts down our ability to really think, because it's unstable, because we can't figure out what exactly is going on and what's true and what's fact, and we have to find other sources. We have to take time, and I think he's very good at removing that quality that is so important in trauma treatment, which is time to think, time to take thoughts that are our own, to consider what is going on through our own experience first, and then react to what's going on in the outside world. So I think that's a very challenging aspect of him and his character and the way he conducts himself. That is preventing my patients from doing the work that they need to do. It's adding another layer upon the challenges they already have. And I think for the rest of us who may or may not have other traumas, most of us do, that this digs up, just like for your patient, old traumas, old destabilizations, because it's an extremely difficult reality to navigate right now.
So Trump is like a train wreck. We can't look away. But I think your other point...
Yes, we can.
But I think he is like a train wreck, period. And we can't look away. But I think you're making a more subtle psychological point, which is worth, I think, highlighting, which is there's something about the relentless pace of this. We're essentially, it's like waves off the ocean. We just keep being slapped and slapped and slapped with one outrageous thing after another, 5, 6 of them a day. And so I think what you're saying is there's something about it's not just that this bad guy got power, but the relentless assault on our sort of cognitive and emotional faculties and our reality testing, our very reality testing that is being constantly assaulted and creating confusion, that process, that pace of relentless assault is itself damaging.
Absolutely, and it's a perfect storm in a way of the sort of social media success, or the success of social media channels, combined with the fact that we all have mobile devices that can reflect our reactiveness to pieces of news. And yeah, it's not just that there's a bad guy who's more showman than politician or statesman for definite reasons. It's also that we are in this constant 24-hour news cycle, 24-hour social media channels that are open to us at all times, and it's a match. It's that Trump has been able to harness these channels of Twitter and Facebook and gotten free advertising through these channels, because he knows what draws people's attention. And I think, considering that, I mean, it's so hard, I speak from personal experience, it's so hard to turn away. But maybe if we are aware that this is something that makes him potent, then we can maybe do something to stop reposting the most outrageous thing you saw that day, or really kind of considering, oh my God, is this really true? Or taking 5 minutes to really take in the article and maybe even say, I'm not going to repost this, or because it is hard when you're getting all of these bits and pieces of upsetting news. We want to share it, but maybe social media is not the place to do it. It's hard to know. It's really like something I'm scratching my head over. But I am telling patients, let's turn off the news feed if you're feeling particularly activated this week. It might be a way to stabilize, because, I mean, that's all I can speak to is how do we best stabilize ourselves. How the digital media era is going to shift or change is not really in my purview.
Right. But we can turn it off.
We can turn it off. We can take a break, and I think we would do well to just for our own mental health do that, and to promote an ability to take some measured action rather than reactive action.
But it's easier said than done. I've had many colleagues, people who are supposedly more resilient than the traumatized patients that you were referring to, tell me that I just can't stop. It's making me crazy. It's making me, it's like the car accident we can't look away from. Everything is so outrageous and shocking that we just can't turn away. But it's every day. It's not one incident, it's every day. And so we've become addicted to, I just had this conversation with my Aunt Linda, who I know is going to watch this video. She's saying, this is ruining my life. And I said, well, you have to stop watching MSNBC from, from Hardball at 7 to, Lawrence O'Donnell at 11, then watching Morning Joe in the morning and checking the Washington Post and the New York Times and Politico during the day. She said, oh, I can't stop that.
I know. It's really hard. And I think Trump kind of keys into, inadvertently, but I think there was David Remnick of the New Yorker talked about how one of Sean Spicer's press conferences had higher ratings than anything going on the news channels or the other channels, network channels, that at that hour. And he was saying, David Remnick was saying that it is sort of infotainment, but it's also because we're worried. And I think that goes back to a level of traumatization that we can't look away because it's so outrageous, but also we can't look away because we want to stay safe. And we think that if we keep our eye on the ball, then it's not going to go off the rails or something like that. And I think that that's something to question, because right now we're in an era where the news media cycle is like an onslaught. We can't possibly take it all in the rate that it's being delivered to us. It's an inundation, and it's just simply because of the media channels that we have available to us. But we've never had this before, and it's something that we have to sort of learn how to manage. Because I do think we will be flooded. We are flooded. In that sort of clinical, technical term of being emotionally flooded. We are being emotionally flooded by the flood of news information, which is designed. The age-old journalists, they ran after fires and police cars. That was their job. And this is. I'm not saying that. Bona fide, traditional media, legacy journalists, or people really doing their job are not trying to be sensationalist. However, to a certain degree, that's what's going to rise to the top. That's what's going to catch our eye, and somehow we have to work against that to stabilize ourselves.
Well, some of this is really based on how the brain is organized, that we're meant to focus on threats, right? That's a survival mechanism, that the people who didn't focus on threats didn't live to reproduce. And
yes.
But now it's sort of hijacked our whole neuronal system where we feel under threat every single day. And so we can't look away, not just because we're, fascinated, but because our brain is saying, this is a threat, you better pay attention to this.
Yeah. I mean, I actually find myself talking neurobiology a lot in sessions, just to kind of give my patients a little bit more objectivity on what's going on if they're feeling crazy or particularly anxious, to kind of talk about, what we had been trained in, a window of tolerance, which is the area of where our cognitive abilities are most functional, which is a space of calm. And if we are activated by our fear centers, then we're going to be moving out of that window. And so we're going to either disassociate, which is numb out, or we're going to panic. And so how do we keep ourselves in that cognitive space of tolerance, that window of tolerance? It is to do things that organize our brains, which is take a walk, take space, be with people who are safe, be in places that are safe. These are for my trauma patients. This is what we work on. So we calm this hyperactivated brain. So we promote less activation. We avoid crowds. We avoid multiple levels of stimuli. And unfortunately, the internet is a whole host of kinds of stimuli. It's clicking, it's visual, it's, you know, sometimes oral if we're looking at different news sites, video channels. In our hands, we have a sensory overload device. And
Yes. So here's
we
the
need
perfect
to unplug
storm.
from that.
Here's the perfect storm I think you were talking about. We've entered an era where we all have a sensory overload device in our pocket, and we're literally being flooded with threatening news every minute.
Yeah.
And this activates what the psychological process that they call flooding. Maybe you could say a little more about what that psychological process of flooding is that's being triggered by this actual news flooding.
Well, in my trauma patients, when they speak maybe at a pace that's a little bit too fast for them in terms of going over their trauma history, meaning a lot of potent information comes out in one session, which sometimes happens, they become overwhelmed. And when the brain becomes overwhelmed, that window of tolerance I was talking about narrows. And so it's like a overfull teacup. You keep pouring water into it and it's gonna overflow. And that potent, highly emotional, highly activating material causes us to shut down. And so cognitively, the prefrontal cortex, PFC, shuts down and the amygdala lights up. And so, I mean, I'm not a neurobiologist, so this is my general understanding of it. And so we become reactive rather than thoughtful because our fear centers are activated, and this is evolution. We are going to go to our more sort of basic centers rather than our more higher centers of thinking because those are overwhelmed and incapacitated. And so what is of deep concern in this era of Trump is that we have this constant societal political atmosphere of overwhelm. And so we're being thrown into a reactive place rather than a thoughtful place. And I think that is a real danger because it means crisis. So crisis, if you talk about that as being a place of not thinking, a place of reacting, a place where language can't be used, where you're running around to put out the fire, to deal with the emergency, it's not a place where you can make complicated thoughts and make complicated interactions and work together and build coalitions. This is a place of see the danger, react to the danger, and it has its place, but it's not. It can't be our daily state. We can't sustain it, for one, physically, mentally, and to the point of your aunt. Like we're exhausted. We're going to be exhausted, and
I think we are already exhausted.
Yeah, we are exhausted, and like the rule of law requires that we think. We need to hold to these pre-existing legal statutes that were put in place for a reason, or if we want to change them, think about why we want to change them, how we want to change them, not create a crisis so that we change them without thinking, which is, I think, I don't know if it's premeditated, but the danger of crisis is that it creates exceptions to rule of law, and
well, maybe that's one of the intentions. Maybe that, I mean,
yeah,
that in other words, maybe Trump is smarter than we think, and he is flooding us to shut down our prefrontal cortexes.
Right.
Because we're so flooded, we can't think straight.
Yeah. We can't think straight. Yeah, we can't use language to talk to each other about what is going on exactly. And then we're going to make bad decisions. I mean, like, that's a very sort of two-dimensional way of saying it. But I mean, I think he's in that state all the time. And I don't know.
Good point.
I don't know if it's he's smarter than we think, or he's just dragging us into his reality, of 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 this narcissistic, unilateral state of being, which he seems to need, to broadcast constantly, and to the point where in that Kofi thing, which I barely understood it. I was busy all day, and I was like, what is this? I mean, he was asleep. He was not thinking, and he was broadcasting a Twitter to the globe. I mean, it's really the apotheosis of an absurd situation. But this is where we are, and we have to. I guess we have to recognize that this is where we are, so we can stop it in our own minds. What we can govern is ourselves.
So in a way, it's almost like a public health crisis that we have a massive, I mean, it's been written about this massive anxiety attacks that have spread across the country, but what we're saying is something even more subtle is happening neurologically, that everyone's amygdala is lighting up. If we had a portable PET scanner and we went around Manhattan, we'd see everyone's amygdala lit up like a Christmas tree, and their prefrontal cortex shut down. And this is a brain disorder that he's induced in millions of people.
Yeah, it's a trauma epidemic, maybe. I that sounds extreme, but it may not be. It may not be. And whether Trump is catalyst or
patient zero of the trauma epidemic.
Yeah. I mean, it is something to really consider. I mean, that's the lens that I look at things through now, and it helps, and I feel like there are a lot of people who aren't my patients who are saying, is this for real? Like, should I be feeling this way? I'm very upset and I can't sleep, all these things. And I think it's important to say, yeah, it is real. It's unprecedented. It's destabilizing, and do what you can to stabilize yourself. However, whatever works for you, because if we are stable, then we can think. If we're not stable, we cannot think. That's just the reality of our human brains.
Yeah. I think meditation is very helpful in that regard as well. To get calm into that space you were talking about, into that range where we're not hijacked by being overwhelmed.
Yeah, any kind of mind-body connection helps. For those who have a practice of yoga or even running, any kind of activity that brings us into the body is helpful. We recommend it to our patients all the time. But a walk is helpful. Something that gets us out and using our physical selves as well as our mental selves.
So unfortunately, since much of our early clinical work is, especially if you're a psychoanalyst, is based on helping people to see that their fantasies are much more horrible than the reality. And now we're in a situation we have to say, it's actually as bad as you think. And I'm just as scared as you are.
Yes, exactly.
So that's where we are.
Or worse.
Right. Because I'm reading twice as much news as you are.
Yes, exactly. It's not just in your head.
It's not just in your head. Of course, that's a clinical service as well, to validate that it's to reality test and to validate reality, which of course people in the trauma field do a lot. But we've spent so much of the early part of our career helping people to separate fearful fantasies from reality. So often we've said, it's never as bad as you think. That it's really a role reversal as therapists to have to say, no, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
It really is as bad as you think.
Yeah, it really is one of those things. It's like, should I be really thinking about this? And I was, it was since the election, it was such a hard thing to say, why are people having these trauma responses or these pre-PTSD responses, insomnia, disassociation, random moments of sadness, maybe they could be related to mourning as well, but when nothing technically disastrous has happened. And so in trauma treatment, a lot of times, since particularly with survivors of childhood sexual trauma, we're left with the symptoms rather than the history or rather than the narrative, and so we work backwards. And I worked backwards, and it is something to consider, that this election was a trauma, much like a natural disaster, much like a terror attack, much like a death. And people are getting re-traumatized again and again and again by these other associated impacts. So it's a puzzle and an ongoing question as to how we help people stop this cycle of re-traumatization.
Well, maybe you've identified a new disorder, pre-traumatic stress disorder, that, as you say, nothing horrific has happened yet, but we're all sleepless and anxious and overwhelmed because we feel like we are on the verge of total catastrophe every day.
Yeah, and a person that has a lot of really interesting things to say about this, per election law and per digital media, Nathaniel Persley, who I quoted in my chapter, talks about, I had the opportunity to talk to him in person, and he talked about how Trump got elected, and he has a lot of things to say about it in his article, Can Democracy Survive the Internet? But he speaks on the fact that a lot of people who voted for Trump had lost faith in traditional institutions. And he was saying that it was off of these surprise, unprecedented big disasters like the financial crisis in 2008, or like the terrorist attacks, or even Hurricane Sandy. These things that folks can't predict cause them to feel very, very unstable already. And I think maybe without knowing, maybe with knowing, maybe they don't regret their vote, but they decided to go with somebody who was completely not a part of any institutional affiliation. Trump kind of came out from more the media and entertainment world rather than traditional politics. And so that surprise factor, I think, is really hard for us to sustain. Like, it's hard for us to deal with the unknown. And I think that unfortunately, or paradoxically, he's opened us up to a lot of unknowns daily. We don't know from morning to afternoon what's going to come next. And I think that has really sort of become an exponential dread. And that is again a challenge of people in our field as to how to help people sustain or hold what is truly like a human state, which is the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen from one minute to the next in reality, but I think we like to think that we can depend on certain things. And now all of that is kind of coming.
Even if it's an illusion, some of our mental health is dependent on the idea that there are some fixed, stable things in our reality that we can count on. And what's happening now is it seems like none of the guardrails are a sure thing.
Right. And I think that's going back to your point about meditation, which is really taking each moment and being in that moment, is why it's helpful. Not only its somatic benefits, but it's positioning our minds where we are when we are in the places that we are, and kind of holding to that place as a place of safety and stability and strength, rather than relying on the next moment or relying on, knowing that we're going to be hearing something not incendiary when we next open the newspaper website that we have chosen to look at. to kind of find an inner stability rather than rely on sort of outside markers for that. It's asking a lot. It's asking for a lot of sort of self-regulation.
And for people who struggle with self-regulation to begin with, we've essentially put all of us, in a deregulating environment.
Yes, and I think that is really sad. I think it's honestly, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see a whole sort of swath of people greater than our populations grapple with this. It is in and of itself overwhelming, but we also have to deal with what we have in front of us and do what we can to shift internally, externally. I think, from our standpoint, my standpoint, what we can do at the very basic is we have jurisdiction over our minds and ourselves. So we can seek help to strengthen that jurisdiction, and then from there do what we can with what we have.
So less MSNBC and more meditation.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I got it.
Wholeheartedly.
Okay, I'm going to try to take that to heart. Physician, heal thyself.
For everybody.
You hear that, Aunt Linda? Okay.
More meditation.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us today. This has been very illuminating, very helpful, and very validating.
Yes, well, I hope so. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.